Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. You're listening to Home in Progress by RepcoLite Paint, sponsored by Benjamin Moore. And I had a funny moment driving to work the other day, and I kind of felt like I had a split personality disorder. And I'm kind of just teasing, but I really don't know how else to describe it. Here's what happened. My roof is leaking in 3 spots, okay? I'm on it. I've got estimates to get it fixed. I'm trying to get the money together, blah, blah, blah. That's going on. Then this past week, I went to start up my sprinklers, for the first time this year, and I find out the pump's deceased. Now, I assumed I was going to just get a new pump for a couple $100 and we'd be good, but then I researched how much it was going to cost, and I was literally blown away by the expense of a new pump. So all of that's going on, okay? Then the other day I'm driving to work and it's raining like crazy. I can barely see the road. And inside, part of me is so pumped, so relieved, so happy, so pumped. Get it? The yard was dying, the flowers were dying, and now they're getting a ton of rain. But then, as I'm thinking that, I started talking to myself. And another part of me said, yeah, that's great, but think about all the water coming in the attic. You're so worried about your yard and your plants, but the attic's probably filling up with water right now. And when that part of my brain spoke, I literally answered and said, whoa, that's crazy talk. Come on, it's never leaked badly enough to cause problems. Why would it start now? You're just trying to scare us and freak us out. And that's when it hit me. I was literally arguing with 2 parts of my own brain. So I'm not really sure what that means. And it honestly sounds even worse now that I called it out and said it out loud. So I'm going to leave it right there and just jump into the show. And let's start by talking about a town up north in Charlevoix. If you're not familiar, Charlevoix is north of Traverse City on US 31. Okay, it's a resort town, really picturesque. It's situated on an isthmus between Lake Michigan and Lake Charlevoix. An isthmus. I don't have any idea that I'm pronouncing that correctly. I think I'm overemphasizing the th in that. I-S-T-H-M-U-S, isthmus. It's a narrow strip of land bordered on 2 sides by water. So look at what we've learned just today so far. We're already learning geography and stuff like that. All right, so that's Charlevoix. Let's just move on. It's a beautiful area. It's only a day trip away if you're located in West Michigan. And if you go to Charlevoix, you're going to see something, or you can see something that's entirely unique to Charlevoix. Mushroom houses. Have you heard of these before? Charlevoix's mushroom houses. They've got curved stone walls, roofs that roll and swoop all over the place. They completely look like something out of a fairy tale. They are crazy cool. They've earned a few nicknames over the years. Mushroom houses, I've already given you that one. Hobbit houses, gnome houses, Flintstone houses, fairy tale houses, on and on and on. They're crazy unique, and they're the creation of a single guy, for the most part, except for maybe a couple. No. They're the creation of this guy. A couple of copies happen later on. We'll talk about that. They're not even really copies. We'll talk about that later. But they're really the creation of a single guy. His name is Earl Young, was Earl Young. And he really should be considered the patron saint of anybody who's been told that they're doing this or that the wrong way. That you can't do it that way, that's wrong. This guy, he's your guy. He's your patron saint. And before I get too far into this, because we're going to talk about him, his inspiration behind him, how they came about. There's just a really fun story here. But before I get too far into it, if you're able to, pull out your little computer, your phone. If you're driving, this is not for you to do. This is not homework for you. But if you are capable, we're all capable. If you're able to safely do this, Google Charlevoix mushroom houses. And that's going to give you an idea what I'm talking about. And it's going to help a lot. If you can't Google them to get a picture of them and see what they look like, let me try to describe them so you've got something in your mind as I talk. All right? They're just so unique. You've got to have at least a visual of them. So picture a storybook cottage, just your classic storybook cottage. Picture that and then cross it with a hobbit house or what you might think of as a gnome house. Make it crazy. Low stone walls, all kinds of curves, put a heavy cedar-shaked roof over top and make sure that the roof isn't smooth and flat. It swoops all over the place. It bends and it droops. Imagine it almost like a floppy hat that sits on top of the stone house. The houses are rounded, they're earthy, they're lopsided, and they're lopsided on purpose. They're completely unlike the straight line houses that we're used to seeing. All right, that's a mushroom house. Or as the designer would prefer, that's an Earl Young house. Now let's talk about how they came about. So let's start with Earl Young. He was born in Mansalona, Michigan in 1889, and his family moved to Charlevoix when he was 11. Now his mom and dad, they owned an insurance company, and they worked at that, making their living. But they also had some, marital distress, marital struggles. So they were working on their marriage, trying to save that in the midst of everything. Now, in the end, they weren't able to put things together, and the marriage ended in divorce. And I only mention that because that stressful home, that stressful home life that Earl Young lived through, that played a big role in the formation of, Builder Earl, who comes about later, right? See, to get away from the stress of what's going on in the home, he spent a lot of time just walking around outside, living outside, walking the shores of a Lake Michigan beach near his home. There's a beach out there because he's on an isthmus. There's water everywhere around him. It's not an island. It's an isthmus. I've learned a new word, and I'm not going to let it go. Anyway, he could get to water wherever he went, basically, and a lot of the beaches out there covered with stones. So he's out there walking. He sees all these stones. He falls in love with stones. Stones in all the colors and all the shapes. It was almost like magic to him. It sounds crazy, but he loved them. He was fascinated with their look, but more than that, it was like they spoke to him of what they could become. All right, how they could fit together to become something like a building or a chimney or a fence. He loved the stone's connection to the earth, to the water, to the landscape, and he later, in later years, came to describe them as almost having personalities. Now, I'm not saying he was nuts. He knew that sounded crazy. He wasn't saying they talked to him. I don't think that's where he was going. But they did talk to him in a way. He would see these rocks and he'd let them speak to him about where they should be used, what they wanted to be. Now, that sounds a little crazy, but I think you can get it. Anyway, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. The guy loved rocks. Let's just leave it at that. Guy loved rocks. He loved stones in a way deeper way. Way more profound way than most of us love rocks and stones. Okay? That's all you really need to know. Now, because of this love of stones and rocks, and because of his love of building things, when he grows up, he heads to the U of M, to study architecture. So he heads off to college, gets there, starts his classes. He's all pumped up. He's going to be the next big thing, maybe. Maybe that's what he's thinking. I don't know. I'm filling in the gaps. I'm freewheeling here. But I do know that once he gets there and starts these classes, he doesn't like the architecture program. It's just too much Victorian stuff, too much Greek this and Roman that. Earl didn't want to talk about that kind of architecture. He had different ideas for what buildings could or should look like. So he quits after just a year. He quits all of that. This is all bunk. I'm not going to do this anymore. And he goes back home and he starts working in the family business, selling insurance with his mom. He also got into real estate. He did some bakery adjacent type things. He did a lot of different things. He was like I don't even know. I was going to say a Renaissance man, but I would have to look up what exactly that means, and I don't want to just throw terms and titles around. He kind of did bakery stuff. He sold real estate. I think he sold real estate for like 60 years. So even as he's building houses, he's selling real estate, and he, sold insurance. Okay, so he's doing all of that, but deep down, Earl inside, the spirit of Earl really wants to build homes and structures and stuff like that. It's calling him. And so he decides, you know what? I'm going to jump in and I'm going to build something. I'm going to build a house, even though I'm not an architect. Even though I don't really know what I'm doing, I'm going to build a house. Even though I don't have what you might call the proper or maybe even, possibly the necessary skills. I don't have those things. I've got a dream, I've got a vision, and I'm driven to succeed, so I'm going to do it. So he jumps in. I found a great article that referred, maybe this will give you just a snippet of a picture of Earl Young, who he is and what drove him. I found a great article that referred to him as 5'1", 5'1", though other places cite him as 5'3". Either way, I towered over him. So, that should tell you something. So 5'1", 5'3", they described him like that, but he was also charismatic and egotistical and innovative and utterly, utterly driven. Basically, Earl Young thought he could do whatever he set his mind to, and he was out there to prove it. And the force of his personality, made him succeed. So anyway, he decides, I don't want to just do insurance and real estate and baked goods or whatever else I was doing. I want to build things. So he jumps in and he builds his first home in 1918, and between 1918 and 1921. He builds a home for him and his family. And he's got a wife at this point, and he decides, let's just build a house for me. This is the only house that he built that actually uses blueprints. And I'll explain how we worked around that later. It's really worth hanging around for. So only house that he's built that uses blueprints, because he partnered with an established architect, because he knew that he didn't really know enough yet to do this on his own. He needed help. So he partners with this guy. They draw up blueprints. They build this house, this first house for Earl Young and his family. And, he moves in, but he's never really satisfied with it. It's just not exactly what his vision was. It's just not quite right. And after this first experience, he decided, you know what? I need to work alone. I'm the guy. I've got the answers. I don't need to be hampered by other people's ideas or the limitations that other people impose by saying things had to be done this way or that way, that's how building works, and you can't do it the way you wanted to do it. Let's do it this way. He didn't want any of that. He wanted to do his own thing. And his vision of what his own thing was going to look like, how did he get to that? Well, we're going to get to where it came from, how he pulled everything together. It's some really crazy stories about rocks, what he did when he found them. You're going to love that. I love that. And then also, like I said, the blueprint thing. He never used blueprints. You're going to love how he worked around that. But we're going to do all of that right after this. Home in Progress is brought to you by RepcoLite Paints and Benjamin Moore. People often think of paint as just another line item on the project supply list. But here's the thing. Everything you do, every hour of prep, every stroke of the brush, all comes down to the quality of the paint. The paint is the project. Make sure it's the best. Gnome houses, hobbit houses, the mushroom houses of Charlevoix, Michigan. Have you heard about them? We've been talking about these houses, and they are, if you look at them, they are straight out of a fairy tale. You're listening to Home in Progress by RepcoLite Paints, sponsored by Benjamin Moore. And last segment, I introduced you to Earl Young, a guy who grew up in Charlevoix. He was born in 1889, so that gives you a time frame. Grew up in Charlevoix, Michigan. He loved long walks on the beach, loved spending time in nature, and he developed an incredibly complex relationship with the rocks and the boulders that he encountered in the landscape that he traveled through. Anyway, last segment, we talked about how he started building these mushroom houses. And how he did that without any real formal training. Just kind of jumped in and did it. He just knew that he wanted to build houses that were completely different from anything else that he'd seen, and he decided to do it alone. He built his first house with the help of an architect, and then he decided to just go it on his own because working with others just didn't work for Earl. Other people had too many ideas that conflicted with his vision. And let's get to his vision, because I think it's really important to identify where this vision came from. And when you look at it, there are a lot of different aspects of life that inspired, Earl Young to come up with this vision. But I'm going to only focus on three of them, because I think these are the three main ones. Three main sources of inspiration that led him to build these remarkable structures. First off, he was inspired by Frank Lloyd Wright's philosophy. He never studied under Frank Lloyd Wright. I don't believe he ever met Frank Lloyd Wright, but he was inspired by Frank Lloyd Wright's philosophy that a building should belong to its site instead of just being plopped on it. It has to grow out of that site in a sense. And Earl Young took that philosophy probably even further than Wright did. And that's why his houses look incredibly organic. They literally look like they grew up out of the earth, like they're a living thing that just kind of grew up out of the spot and amongst the trees and the landscaping all around them. They just look like they grew out of that spot. So he really was inspired by Frank Lloyd Wright's philosophy there. A second thing that inspired him basically was rebellion, against the architectural styles that he was inundated with at the U of M. We talked about it in the last segment, but when he went to school, he did a year of school at U of M for architecture, but he bailed on it because everything in that class, it was all Greek columns and Roman stuff and Victorian stuff. He basically felt it was a duplication, of dead styles. Lots of symmetry, lots of perfect lines. It was boring, right, to Earl Young. It was tired. It'd been done before. So he rebelled against that. And that's partly why his houses lean into their lopsided, uneven shapes that really don't reflect any given style. That's part of the reason. The third inspiration, and if we want to talk about why his houses are lopsided and how they lean into that shape, this third inspiration, this is probably the most important thing. It was his fascination with the rocks and the boulders and the stones that made up the landscape around him, right? We talked about that. But in the lakes, on the beaches, in the woods, in the quarries, all around him, where he's growing up, all of those stones with all of the different shapes and the colors and all of the history of these stones. He's looking at these stones and he's thinking about how old they are, how ancient they are. There's history. These stones have been there long before he was, and long after he was, they'll still be here doing their thing. All of that intrigued him, and it shaped his ideas. And it literally shaped the houses that he built. Because he didn't work from blueprints and from a plan per se. He found the boulders first and let them speak. And then he constructed the house around all of that. Okay, and I mentioned earlier, he only used blueprints on his first house, and that was because he worked with an established architect. I told you it was really fun what he did instead of using blueprints. Do you know what he did instead of using blueprints? Do you have a guess? Maybe some of you know. If you know, don't spoil it for the rest of the people, around you. But just make a guess if you don't know. What do you think he did? What would you do if you didn't have access to blueprints? What would you do? Well, I'd maybe sketch it out on paper, something like that. Apparently, paper wasn't available to Mr. Earl Young. He was more gritty. He was more Mother Nature's son, I guess we would say. He literally would get the builders together on the site, and he'd clean a little spot on the ground, a nice little dirt spot, and then he'd get a stick, and he'd draw in the dirt and show them what he wanted done. It basically like he's crafting a football play at recess in elementary school. That's how he's drawing the buildings. He's drawing them in dirt, showing the workers, and then saying, there you go. Yeah, just build that. That's what I'm thinking. Fortunately, when he got married, his wife, Irene, she was an art teacher and an artist. And as the later years happened, she would basically sketch out designs based on what Earl was describing. And that gave the workmen something a little more concrete to work with than Earl's scratches in the dirt. But anyway, the point is, he started with the rocks, right? He let the rocks talk to him, and he let them influence the final design. And that was unheard of. Everyone else was forcing building materials to match a layout that they had primary, first and foremost. This is what it's going to look like. Let's make the building materials fit that. Earl, Mr. Young, found these building materials and said, yeah, let's build around that. And that's why these houses are as strangely intriguing and inviting as they are. They're so organic because they're literally built around the organic shapes. The shapes define the whole building, the whole layout. All right, those rocks, those boulders, I want to talk about them because there's a really fun story with his whole collection of them and how he collected them, but we're going to get to that right after this. Home in Progress is brought to you by RepcoLite Paints and Benjamin Moore. Think about it. You spend hours prepping, sanding, taping, and then finally painting. Don't throw all that work away with an inferior product. The paint isn't just another supply. The paint is the project. Make sure it's the best. Rocks, boulders, and Earl Young. That's what we're talking about. The mushroom houses of Charlevoix on Home in Progress by RepcoLite Paints, sponsored by Benjamin Moore. And last segment, I talked about how Earl Young, the designer of Charlevoix's mushroom houses, how Earl Young had a fascination for stones and boulders and rocks. a fascination beyond the normal fascination that people have with rocks and boulders and stones. All right, it was deeper. I'm not saying it was a problem, that he had issues, but it was deeper than I was going to say a normal person, a regular person's fascination with these things. And we talked about that. We talked about how these rocks and boulders shaped his structures. You know, he didn't just design houses and then make the rocks and boulders fit. He found the rocks and boulders first and then built around them. And what I want to talk about briefly is just how he gathered those rocks, because I think this is such a great story, and it reminds me of me, which is probably why I think it's so great. It reminds me of Little Dan. See, when I was a kid, my main go-to toy was G.I. Joe. Okay, I grew up in the 80s. I had, there was G.I. Joe, and there was, what were the other big ones? Transformers and Masters of the Universe. Masters of the Universe, there's a movie right now, reminds me of my childhood. But G.I. Joe, that was my jam. That's what I cared about. That's what I liked. And I had tons of the little figures, tons and tons. At one point, I had every one that was released. I had as many of the vehicles as I could imagine, or as I could snag. But really, I focused on the figures for sure. And I've still got them. They're all in immaculate condition because I was meticulous even back then as a child. And all these figures, they're in immaculate condition. They're over 40 years old. Amazing collection. I've done an amazing job. Giving myself a lot of kudos here. It's not the point. We can move on. When I would go shopping when I was little, anytime I'd go to the store, mom goes to get groceries, I'd wander off to the toy department to scope out the G.I. Joe figures. And I'd go through the rack looking for ones that I didn't have. And if I found one, it was always rare because I had most of them. But when I found one that was hard to find or hard to come by, if I didn't have the money for it and I knew there was no way I could finagle the money out of mom, I would do something that I'm not terribly proud of, but I would hide that sucker. I'd take it and I'd stuff it somewhere. I'd hide it behind, other toys that were loser toys that nobody was ever going to buy. And I was sure nobody would uncover this secret hidden toy there. And sometimes I'd hide them in other places. I don't believe I was ever successful at hiding them and then, being able to go back and get them because that was my plan. Once I had the money, I was going to go back to the store and find this hidden treasure that I'd stuffed away. I don't think that part ever worked. That would have made for an even better story. But that's what I did. I did that. I'm not proud of it. I confess it. I'm sorry, department store workers who are now probably in, assisted living situations. Maybe you're gasping right now because you finally figured out who this person was who, tormented you all those years ago. It was me. I'm sorry. That's all I can do. Anyway, let's get back to our story. The hero of the story that I'm telling today, Earl Young, the designer of the mushroom houses, he did the exact same thing with rocks. I love that. And it gets even better than you're probably thinking. He'd be touring around hunting, rocks and stones and stuff like that. But I'm not talking about pocket-sized stuff. I'm talking about boulders, huge, gigantic things. He would find them all over northern Michigan. And if he found one that he loved, I love this rock. I love this boulder. It's a nice boulder. I want that boulder. But if he didn't have a house for it, he didn't know where he was going to use it. He hid it. He absolutely hid it. How do you hide a boulder, you ask? I'm so glad you did. He would bury them in the woods or wherever he would find them. And sometimes he would even sink them in Lake Michigan. I mean, I think that tops me hiding G.I. Joes in this toy store. Sinking boulders in Lake Michigan so that you can retrieve them later. And he did retrieve them later. That's the even better part of this story. He didn't want anybody else to find him. He wanted to know that he was the only one. He'd keep this, this record in his brain about what he had hidden all over the place. Maybe he had treasure maps. I don't know. But he had this map in his brain, at least, of all these different rocks, what they look like, where he might use them. And when he'd come across a project, and he would realize, oh, I know the exact stone that's perfect for that. He would know where it was, and then he would go and he would extract it and bring it back. And when I say extract it, think about that. He was born in 1889, I think, if I remember right. He built his first house in 1918 and 1921. He's building through the years, but he doesn't have fancy excavation, tools and things, that are going to make it easy to haul a multi-ton stone out of the lake. He had to be seriously committed. Maybe he should have been committed. No, I don't want to say that because that's not fair to him. I don't think he was nuts at all. I think he just loved his art and he was willing to really sweat and really bleed for his art. But he would come back to these stones, to these hidden stones, and he would extract them and haul them with teams of workhorses. It's really mind-blowing how he did it. It's kind of, to me, like it's on par, not exactly on par. It's similar. It's adjacent in a way to the whole pyramid thing. How did they do that? Was it aliens? I don't think it was aliens with Earl Young. It was just this 5'1", 5'3" guy with a spine of iron or steel and just, a will to match and a bunch of horses. And he would get these stones out and he'd bring them back and he'd use them on whatever house. I just love that. Hiding rocks and stones and boulders, I think that's absolutely, to me, one of my favorite things I've stumbled across in a long time. All right, so we've got all of that going on. That's what he's doing to build these houses. Incredibly unique stones. He's letting the stones tell the story, letting the stones shape the houses. One last thing I want to mention as I'm talking about these mushroom houses, these gnome houses, these hobbit houses, these Earl Young houses in Charlevoix. One last thing I want to mention is the fireplaces. There's a million other things I could talk about. I've got limited time, but I do want to hit these fireplaces before I wrap this particular part of the topic up. He treated fireplaces like the heart of the house. They weren't just a feature in an Earl Young house. They were the heart, the beating heart of the house. And in many cases, the fireplace would shape the entire design. And so they were hugely important in that regard. But also, they were built with huge stones and boulders. Most fireplaces are built from lots of small stones and stuff like that. Earl Young's signature move was one enormous boulder as the centerpiece. Now, a famous one, if you want to look it up, is the Weather Vane Restaurant's fireplace in Charlevoix. Of course, it's in Charlevoix. The Weather Vane Restaurant, they have a fireplace that's made of a single 9-ton boulder. And Earl Young saved that exact boulder. I don't know where he hid that one. I have no idea where that one was hidden, but he saved it for 26 years before he found the exact perfect spot for it. And the first time they set it, the floor sank under the weight, and they had to redo all the supports and stuff like that. Basically, pull off an engineering stunt to make it work. And he did, again, all of that before hydraulic loaders existed, right? He's moving these things with horses and chains and an occasional crane and just sheer willpower. So, fireplaces, big signature move, big signature part of these mushroom houses. All right, Earl Young, he kept designing and building well into his 80s. His last completed design is the Castle House, and it was built between 1970 and 1973 when he was in his early 80s. All told, he left Charlevoix with roughly 30 structures. There's always a little bit of variance here when people count them, but it's commonly counted as about 26 to 28 homes and then 3 or 4 commercial buildings. Each one, more or less looks less like it was built on the land and more like it just kind of grew there. You got to check these out. By the end of his life, he was legally blind, but he was still designing and he was doing it by touch. He'd have workers describe the stonework, describe what they were seeing. Then he'd run his hands over the boulders to decide whether the boulder matched the house and was, literally right for this situation, all by feel. He died in 1975, and the last thing he did, this last project that he worked on, was placing a single boulder to mark the neighborhood entrance. And so basically he ended the way he started, setting a rock just so in the exact perfect spot. Earl Young. As we wrap all this up, a few things. First off, no one's ever really copied him. His style pretty much starts and stops with him. There is one kind of exception. His daughter, Virginia, she built a few houses like this later, but that was more, family carrying on the work than somebody duplicating his style. All right, so that's interesting. But here's what I think is the really cool thing, super cool thing. It's one of the reasons I'm talking about it. You can go see them today. They're literally just a few hours away from those of us in West Michigan. So go online and you can find locations and houses to drive by. Big thing, though, remember, these are personal residences. They're private property, so don't go peeking in windows. That's not going to end well. You're not going to have a good road trip. You're going to see a lot. Well, I don't know how much you'll see. You'll see the back of a police cruiser. If you've never been in one, maybe that's the way to go. You can see the Charlevoix jail. Get that, firsthand experience there. But don't go peeking in houses or peeking in the windows. Don't go walking through the rooms and stuff like that. But you can drive by them and see them. But after saying all of that, there are some exceptions, where you literally can go in and experience them. First off, the Weather Vane restaurant. I mentioned that. It's the one with the big fireplace, the big boulder for a fireplace. You can go in, you can go there, eat. It's a restaurant. You just go in and do what you do at a restaurant. Use the restroom if you want. You can, order whatever you want. Salads. They've got everything. I don't know why I'm talking about that. My mind wanders. The Weather Vane restaurant. You can check that out online at weathervanerestaurant.com. You can even check out the menu, see if they've got stuff you'd like. For sure, look at the pictures. It's beautiful. Secondly, you can literally stay in one of these mushroom houses. I think, from what I was gathering, there's a number of them that can be rented out on like Airbnb or Vrbo or something like that. But I know for sure one. One for sure you can rent, and it's Earl Young's personal home. It's on Airbnb. Just go to Airbnb and search out mushroom houses in Charlevoix, and you'll find it. All right, there you go. Something uniquely Michigan, and maybe something you didn't know about before. And it's cool because the guy who built all of these, everything we've been talking about, did it without a degree. He did it without training. He did it by going against a lot of different rules. And what I want to talk about next in the last segment is how we take some of what he did and apply it to our own homes. How can we draw inspiration from him and apply it in a practical way in our own design, in basically the work that we do in our homes. I'm going to get to all of that right after this. You're listening to Home in Progress, where the projects are real, the mistakes, they're educational, sometimes painful, mostly educational, and the only thing more stubborn than that old wallpaper on your bathroom wall is your determination to get it fixed. Proudly sponsored by RepcoLite Paints and Benjamin Moore. Paint with a purpose, people who care, and everything you need to get the job done right. And we're back. You're listening to Home in Progress by RepcoLite Paints, sponsored by Benjamin Moore. And for the last few segments, we've been up in Charlevoix, Michigan with Earl Young and his mushroom houses. And we talked about who he was, how he built these things with no degree, no training, no blueprints even, just a head full of rocks. And I mean that in the nicest way possible. A head full of rocks and a will of iron. And that's a fun story on its own. But I didn't want to leave it there. Because honestly, the more I dug into this guy, the more I realized he wasn't just building weird houses, really cool houses up north. He was living out a whole bunch of ideas about how to make a space feel like yours. And those ideas don't just apply to a stone cottage in Charlevoix. They apply to your own house, to my house, to the place you're sitting in right now. So that's what I want to do with this last segment, and I may not have time to get all of this on air. I will get all of it in the podcast. So go find Home in Progress as a podcast, and you can catch all of this segment. There's a lot of good points, a lot of practical stuff here that you can use. But that's what I'm going to do in this last segment, and I want to be upfront about how this is going to go. It's not a step 1, step 2, step 3 kind of a thing. Follow this and your house is perfect. That's not what I'm after at all. I'm not building a system here. It's more like here are 5 or 6 random things that we can steal from Earl Young and then put to work in our homes today. Some of them might click for you, might make sense, some might not. Grab the ones that do and work with them. All right, let's start with the one that I think's the strongest, and it's really, really personal for me. Earl Young, he found stones that really spoke to him, right? And then he built homes around those stones. When he had to, he even hid them, right? We talked about that. He buried them. He sank them in the lake. He did whatever he had to do so he'd be able to use them when he found the right spot for them. Basically, he knew the importance of it when a piece, when a rock, when a stone, when a boulder spoke to him, and he let that piece guide him. Now, every now and then, we find something when we're out and about. hitting the antique malls, the flea markets, the whatevers, wherever you go, garage sales, you name it. Every now and then we're out there and something speaks to us. We find something or it finds us. Whatever it is, it's a piece of art, it's a piece of furniture, a rug, whatever it is. We find this thing or it finds us, like I said, and we're stunned by it. You've been there, right? You've just looked at this thing and thought, this is amazing. I love this thing. It's just captured my interest. It grabs us in ways that a lot of other things don't. We walk by tons of stuff on a regular basis in shops and in stores and all of that. But every now and then something just stops us and we stand there and look at it. It's like lightning when that happens. And sometimes, I've personally done this, we let those things go. And we let them go, because I don't have a place for it. I don't know where I'd use this. I don't have a place for it. So you let it go. I can't tell you how many times I've done that. And then I regret it later, almost instantly. And then I rush back to the store and I find that it's gone. So don't do that. Take a tip from Earl Young. When something strikes you like that in a deep, emotional, personal way, secure it. If you don't have a place for it yet, wait. You'll find a place for it. Sometimes you may even design an entire room around it. And I told you at the beginning, this was a really personal point for me. And here's where I could really make that personal connection. I have a bust of Cleopatra. I didn't get those words out fast enough. And I feel like they're questionable words. It's like a statue thing, a bust of Cleopatra. And it makes no sense, right? For this to be in a home like mine, in a little brick ranch. Why would I have this? It makes no sense. But when I saw it, I loved it. And I don't know why I loved it, but I loved it. I'd never seen anything like it. I think I've talked about it on the show before. I'm sure I have. It spoke to me. And so I snagged it. I don't normally do that, but I snagged it. It was a little more expensive than I normally would have paid. But for some reason, I needed it. I had to have it. I loved it. And I bought it. I had no idea what I was going to do with it. And so I bring it home, and like I said, I had no idea what to do with it. So it just kind of sits there, out of the way. It's not on display anywhere. It's just kind of tucked away. I ended up using it at RepcoLite for some events because there was no use for it at home. So we used it at some events, and then all of a sudden, I'm working in my living room a few years back, and I realized I could set that bust of Cleopatra on the armoire that holds the TV. And I did that, and it kind of looked a little bit weird there. I thought maybe I'm doing something crazy, but then I thought it just needs things around it, so I filled the space around it with brass candlesticks. No candles, just empty candlesticks, all different kinds. And basically from there, that thing took over the whole room. The whole space started to revolve around it. And I spent months and months and months hunting for unique candlesticks and Egyptian, pieces that didn't feel too fakey or too silly. Looking for all these things. I found some really, really great stuff. It wasn't easy to come by, but when I found it, oh man, was it fun and was it cool. My favorite piece that I added was an Art Nouveau painting of Cleopatra by a Michigan artist. It's on a tattered old canvas. It's flaking. The paint is flaking in places, but it's big. It's like 3 foot by 3 foot, and it sets the whole tone for the room. And I absolutely love that room. I don't care if anybody else on this planet hates that room. I love it. And it all started because I snagged a Cleopatra bust that made no sense, but that spoke to me. So all that to say, don't let something wonderful go by. When it speaks to you, snag it. You'll find a use for it later. All right, another idea, decorate for yourself, not for resale, not for the neighbors, not for the internet. This is Earl's rebellion. We talked about that in the first segment. He refused other people's rules and the limits that they tried to put on him. What I'm trying to say here is if you're not selling your house right now and you're not thinking that that's coming up in the next little bit, just let go of the idea that you need to design for somebody else's tastes. Don't avoid colors that you love because you're afraid your sisters are going to think you're nuts. I kind of been there. Don't do that. Don't skip out on furniture or art that you love because you think people on Facebook are going to hate it. I don't know how many of us do that, but I know from talking to people in the paint store that there's enough of us that really are influenced very heavily by what we think other people are going to feel and say about our spaces. We're worried about looking dumb or silly with our design. But here's the thing. Blindly following other people's ideas that's really boring, and our homes should reflect us. They shouldn't reflect, somebody else's tastes or something like that. It's your home. You spend the time in there, not other people. Let your ideas fill your space. That's something else to think about. Another idea, work with your home's quirks instead of fighting them. I didn't talk about it, but Earl wouldn't cut down trees, on certain lots, so he ended up building around them. The house belonged to its spot. It kind of sometimes worked around trees that were there. So that weird nook that you've got, that sloped ceiling that you don't like, the awkward angle over here, the window in the wrong place, whatever. Quit fighting it, maybe. Maybe that's the way to go. Quit fighting it. The features that people spend real money to fix, often they could be the exact thing that gives the room, incredible character if you just leaned into it. So work around the quirks the way Earl built around a boulder or around a tree. Just think about that. Another thing, Earl treated the fireplace as like the heart of the house, the beating heart of the house, and he let the fireplace shape the whole design. What do we do with that? Well, every room needs, something like that. Not necessarily a fireplace, but a beating heart, the heart of the room, a focal point that the eye lands on, that everything else orbits. When a room feels restless and you can't say why, you can't quite put your finger on it, it's usually because there's no heart, no center. So maybe find something, whatever that is. It could be art, it could be a bold chair, it could be a view, an amazing view out a window. Whatever it is, pick it, commit to it, and then arrange everything in service of it. All right, so that's an idea. Another one that you can consider is play the long game. A home is always in progress. Earl saved one boulder for the Weather Vane restaurant. He saved this one boulder for 26 years waiting for the right spot. He found it and it was perfect. But he knew it's a long game. It's always something in process. Everything is proceeding and progressing. So resist the urge to finish a room in one weekend with a matching set of things from one store. The best rooms get layered over the years, piece by piece, with a few gaps left on purpose. A room that's 50% or 60% you and 40% or whatever still searching beats one that's 100% catalog. Live with the blank wall, live with the empty shelf, or put some filler things on there until the right perfect piece shows up. But resist the urge to feel like you've finished it, that you're done and now it's time to relax. Let it keep growing, organically. Let it morph and evolve based on who you are and how your family and your life and your personality is evolving. That's a space you're going to want to spend time in. That's a space that's really, really interesting to hang out in. Let's see here. Another idea. Build a sense of place in your home. What I'm getting at here is Earl used the literal, landscape around him, not just building around the landscape, but he used the materials, from the landscape around him. Michigan boulders off the beach, stone from the quarry down the road. He used all of those things. So bring in materials and objects, maybe, that actually come from somewhere, near you or mean something to you. Not just something that fits the design. And this goes back, it kind of is married to the whole Cleopatra thing I talked about, but find things that speak to you, that matter, not just that fill the gap color-wise or, texture-wise, but something where the piece itself has value. Look for those things, real wood, stone, real plants, regional art, a piece from a trip or maybe a local maker, something like that. When everything that you've got is mass-produced, a house feels, it can feel like a hotel. It can feel very, cookie cutter, but a handful of things in the room with roots really make it feel like yours. Another way to think about this is something, I don't know, I'm sure other people call it. For me, I think about it as the search, the value of the search. I go looking, we hit a lot of antique places and a lot of, flea market-y places, and we find things for our home to use as decor that really aren't decor. This really technically wasn't created to be decor. It's just items that at one point in history had very practical uses. But the search, trying to find, just the right thing and just poring over shelves that normally you would walk past because, there's nothing there that you would put, on a shelf. And yet all of a sudden behind everything, you find this whatever it is. Some funky pliers that looks unlike any other pliers you've ever seen, and it's really, really interesting, and you realize it's perfect for that shelf or whatever. The fun of that whole process, it's like a quest that you were on, and you found, the holy grail of items or whatever you want to call it, and you brought it home, and it becomes a story that whether you tell it or not, it's something that you live out. And every time you see that piece, you remember the search that brought you to it. The piece has value way beyond just what it does. But for me, stay away, or at least make sure that you're not just filling your space with stuff that you're getting from, a mass-produced, just a department store kind of thing. Find those unique items, bring them in, make sure they've got value, and not value, meaning. That's primarily what you're looking for, is meaning. Last one that I've got, kind of a bonus, trust your own eye. And what I'm getting at here, or basically, I think the better way to say it would be trust your instincts. By the end of his life, Earl, we talked about it, he was legally blind. And he's still designing. And he's doing it by running his hands over the stone to decide if it's right, all by feel. His instincts were that good. He could tell, and he trusted them, even though he didn't have the eyesight to back it up and to prove it to himself. He trusted his own instinct. Trust your instincts, over outside validation. If it feels right to you, if it feels right in your space, it is right. Go with it. All right, that's it. I'm going to let this mushroom house thing go. I thought it was so crazy interesting. Hopefully you enjoyed the deep dive. If you like things like this, conversations like this, and just talking about our homes and making our homes what we want them to be, and, better places to spend time in, make sure you're subscribing to Home in Progress. I've got... I don't know how many episodes we've got now. This is episode 463, so I do know how many. 462 other episodes that you can check out. By all means, dig into them and see what you find. There's a lot of good stuff out there. I've got a number of different co-hosts through the years, a couple of them, maybe three, technically, 3 co-hosts through the years. It kind of colors the show differently, so go and check that out. But for right now, I'm going to sign off for the week and call it good. I hope all of you have a great weekend. Again, subscribe to the podcast if you're not. If you would be willing to leave us a good review. If you're only inclined to leave a bad review, go find another podcast somewhere and, leave it right there. But if you feel like you'd like to leave a good one, it really helps other people find our show. So that'd be great. Anyway, have a great rest of the week. For Home in Progress, I'm Dan Hansen. See you next time.